So let's begin, as we do always, with a recitation of the Praise to Shakyamuni Buddha that's on page 73 of the prayer book. So we'll do this 3 times in English. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then to either 97 or 98 for the short mandala offering, which we'll do as we normally do in English, and then skip the next verse and go to the offering mantra, and then refuge and bodhicitta prayer, once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jang chu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyen gi peso nam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shob. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyab suchi taki chunyen gi peso nam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shok. Okay, let's do a short meditation then before we begin the class tonight. So as usual, we'll start with a few minutes of focused meditation on the breath to calm the mind a bit, to let go of whatever distractions, preoccupations we might have in our minds. And then after a few minutes of this silent meditation, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for tonight. So I'll ring the chime to start the meditation. So to set our motivation for tonight, I'd like to work with this analogy that's frequently used. I use this sometimes. Venerable Rabina uses it frequently. The idea being that our minds are sort of like a bed of soil in which we ideally want to have a beautiful garden. But in that soil, we also see that weeds grow. And the first job, and what we're trying to do in this course, is to be able to clearly identify what are the weeds and what are the flowers. What are the things that are useful to our practice, to our development? What are the things that should be discarded, should be abandoned? And having that knowledge then allows us to make better choices about what we do with our minds, what we plant in the soil of our minds, what we cultivate and grow, what we pay attention to. So all of this knowledge is useful first at the level of just having a better garden for ourselves. If we could develop our minds into something that is much more beautiful and peaceful, harmonious, content, and get rid of all that disturbs our minds, we would be in such a better position. We would experience such greater well-being than what we currently experience. But the promise of the Buddha's teachings is that if we do that work fully, and we completely remove everything that is an obscuration in our minds, all the weeds and all the seeds and everything that could in any way get in the way of or obstruct the full garden blooming, that if we are able to attain that state, we will be in the ideal position to help others. Because we will, along the way, have cultivated and developed our compassion, our concern for others, our desire to be of benefit to them, and then, of course, manifesting in the skillful means and the power that we can then affect the welfare of others using all of that. So this development of our own little garden of our minds isn't just for our own benefit, and so that we can have all the tools that we need to be able to help others to beautify their own minds, to purify and pacify their own minds, to tend to their own garden in the same way that we here are trying to do for ourselves right now. So using that analogy, just think about this incredible opportunity that you have right now to do this work. But it is important that we do hold the motivation that goes along with this idea, that we are here with that most far-reaching attitude, wishing to develop ourselves fully, to attain the state of Buddhahood, so that we then can skillfully guide other sentient beings to the same result. And it's for this reason that we're going to continue our investigation of these mental factors, so we can understand our own minds better and help others to do the same. Okay. We are in the secondary afflictions section of this text. Again, there are 6 divisions of these mental factors. We've gone through the omnipresent, the ever-present mental factors, the object-determining or ascertaining mental factors, the virtuous mental factors, which, as I was using the analogy of the garden, these are like the flowers that we want to grow, those mind states that are really useful, beneficial to our own spiritual development. And then we went on to look at the afflictions, and these are the lion's share of these mental factors. 6 root afflictions that we examined, and then the secondary afflictions are 20. So last time we made it up through number 12, non-embarrassment. And again, you have the little sheet. I can put the slide up in front for just a moment. Let me share that. And we'll just go through quickly those that we've looked at already. Again, I'm not going to go through each of them individually, but a lot of these in the first column there, out of the first 10, there were 5 that all had to do with anger being sort of their root, and different manifestations of anger, different ways that anger can be in our minds, in terms of jealousy, spite, and so on, harmfulness. Then we also looked at a number that have attachment involved, such as miserliness, haughtiness, 2, deceit and dissimulation, that have both attachment and potentially ignorance involved. And then the last 2 that we looked at had all 3, meaning that they can be derived from attachment, anger, or ignorance. And so there are, cases where non-shame or non-embarrassment arise in conjunction with any of those 3 root afflictions. So again, recall that non-shame and non-embarrassment, these terms, we looked at them a lot last time. Shame is a virtuous mental factor. We often call it self-respect. It means attending to one's own behavior and within the context of you being the judge of that, trying to uphold your own personal standard for how you want to live your life. Whereas embarrassment or consideration for others is when we talk about others being the witness of that. So in a sense, we have 2 witnesses. Ourselves as the witness, the primary witness for self-respect, and then others as a witness for consideration for others. So we want to make sure that we aren't doing things that will cause others to have some difficulty. If we were in the presence of our teacher, for example, and we were doing things, using harsh words towards somebody or something, this wouldn't be looked upon well by our teachers. They, it wouldn't be good for them. But it also does, of course, harm others, when we are in that state. So if we are thinking about others who would be the recipient of our harm and so on, then that would be a way that non-embarrassment would also be, or embarrassment would be happening. These 2 that are the non-virtues, or I'm sorry, the afflictions, are when we lack those, a lack of self-respect or a lack of consideration for others. So any comments up to this point before we continue on our list to number 13? So just to do a scan of the list to come of what we have, we've pretty much completed those that derive from anger, although there will be a few more that have all 3, so they could have anger in conjunction with them. But most of what we have on the list remaining are factors of ignorance. They have the root of ignorance, and by ignorance here we aren't meaning, again, the subtle ignorance that is there with all of our afflicted states, but rather, and even with some of our virtuous states, but rather this a grosser form of ignorance, a grosser form of not being aware, not knowing, what have you. So let's go to the text then. So in the text we are on page, get to my little marker here, 76. And we're going to move into some in particular that have a role in identifying them in the context of our development of meditation, though also our other virtuous practices. And the first one we're going to look at is lethargy. Lethargy in Geshe Rabtin's text, we'll see it shortly on the slides, is called dullness. Another translation equivalent for this is torpor. We don't use torpor so much in our culture, I don't think. But, but we're talking about here kind of a heaviness of mind. It is in the sort of continuum of leading to sleepiness. Sometimes it's even referred to as a bit of a foggy mindedness, but nonetheless, it's got its own little description, which we'll go through now. Regarding lethargy, the Compendium of Knowledge, this is again a Sangha's text, says, what is lethargy? It is an unserviceability of mind and is involved with ignorance. It has the function of assisting all root afflictions and secondary afflictions. So it's there oftentimes playing a role in helping the other afflictions to arise. So this, it says there, just as it has been said above, it is a heaviness and an unserviceability of the body and mind. Of course, when it's of the body, it's not a mental factor. But when it's of the mind, then it definitely is a mental factor. But it's a factor of ignorance. It's derived from our ignorance, a sort of, again, not knowing in the mind. So the Precious Garland of Nagarjuna's has 2 lines that pertain to this. Let's read those 2 together. Lethargy is a state of inactivity due to heaviness of body and mind. So this idea of it being inactivity or unserviceability, the idea is that there's no movement forward in a really virtuous way. So it becomes sort of, it's not to say that it becomes in and of itself a heavy non-virtue, but it doesn't allow virtue to arise. It doesn't allow you to use your mind in a more serviceable way to create more positive thoughts and so on, or to engage in meditation. Lethargy often leads to difficulties in meditation. The explanation of the Treasury of Knowledge says, what is lethargy? It is a heaviness of the body and a heaviness of the mind. It is an unserviceability of the body and unserviceability of the mind. Then it goes on to talk about, from Lama Tsongkhapa's Lamrim Chenmo, the great exposition of the stages of the path also explains it in this way. Its function is specified as assisting all root afflictions and secondary afflictions, because all afflictions will increase in dependence upon lethargy. In this vein, the exhortation to the exceptional resolve, the Adya Saya Samchodana Sutra, says something like that. Let's read these two, actually read all three of these verses. Phlegm, wind, and bile occur to a great extent in the bodies of those who take joy in sleep and lethargy. Their constituents are in disorder. For those who take joy in lethargy and sleep, their stomachs are unclean due to a bad diet. Their bodies are heavy and their complexions unhealthy. Even their speech is slurred. Those who take joy in lethargy and sleep are confused, and their aspirations for the Dharma degenerate. The childish completely degenerate from all excellent qualities. Their wholesomeness degenerates, and they proceed to darkness. So, I think it is important to talk a little bit about how this is distinguished from one of the other factors that isn't on our list of the secondary afflictions, because it is not an affliction per se, and that's laxity. We often use the term laxity or a sinking of the mind that is only detectable at subtler states of awareness, it seems. So I did want to share a little bit of Geshe Sopa's commentary. This is from volume 4 of Steps on the Path to Enlightenment, his commentary on the Lamrim Chenmo. He said here, now we move on to the second major obstacle to shamatha, laxity. The other obstacle is our next mental factor, excitement. We're calling it excitement and laxity are the two main problematic minds that we run into when we're trying to calm the mind to this state of shamatha, or calm abiding. So it says here, Tsongkhapa says that many Tibetans who translated Indian Buddhist texts into Tibetan used a term for this that can easily be misconstrued. Instead of laxity, some translators used a Tibetan word that usually means discouragement. You should not confuse a feeling of exhausted depression where the mind has no energy or strength with the technical definition of laxity in the context of practicing shamatha. When discouragement is used to indicate laxity, it is referring to weakening or slackness. It is a mind that is not firm or vivid. I often refer to this quality as mental sinking. Most Tibetan practitioners of Tsongkhapa's time seem to define laxity as a lethargic state of mind. It stays on its object of meditation without being distracted, but it has no limpid clarity. According to Tsongkhapa, these yogis have mistakenly conflated laxity and lethargy. The two are not the same. So when this definition was used as a lethargic state of mind, it's conflating the two and making them sound like they're both the same thing. So he says the two are not the same. Lethargy is a cause of laxity. If something is a cause of another thing, it cannot be identical with it, right? Because it's its own distinct phenomenon that leads to something that comes as an effect of it. Because lethargy is the cause of laxity, it is not the same thing as laxity. This is attested to in Kamala Shila's Middle Stages of Meditation. By the way, this is pages 98 and 99 of this book. If, being oppressed by lethargy and sleepiness, you see your mind become lax or in danger of laxity, and so on. That was what Kamala Shila said. So he was right up front saying that if you've got the mind under the sway of sleepiness, foggy-mindedness, lethargy, then if you see laxity occurring on the basis of that, then you would want to address that particular dilemma. He didn't share the rest of what Kamala Shila says, but Geshe Sopa goes on to say, lethargy is a kind of mental heaviness or darkness. It can be the cause of mental dullness and drowsiness. The Sutra Unraveling the Intended Meaning says, if there is laxity due to lethargy and sleepiness, or if you are afflicted by any secondary afflictions in meditative absorption, it is a case of internal mental distraction. So when lethargy causes laxity, he says, the mind experiences distraction. It's a different type of distraction than what we often call distraction. He says this type of distraction is different from the type we discussed previously in the context of excitement. This distraction is directed inward, not to external objects. So oftentimes I talk about that, about the two different forces that, are kind of getting in the way of good, solid meditation. One is the tendency of the mind to be drawn outwards, to go to external objects, which are the minds of excitement and wandering, going all over the place, to being out in la-la land when you're supposed to be on the cushion watching the breath or whatever it is you're focusing on. But then there's the tendency of the mind to be drawn inward too much, because meditation is a process of drawing the mind inward from that distracted or wandering state. But this is a distraction too, when we're drawing inward and then suddenly we get very lethargic. The mind gets very heavy. There's a sleepiness. So it's important to understand that these are both kind of at the level of distraction. And I'm sorry, that's when when the lethargy causes laxity, but then you have laxity as a distraction. I'm sorry, I mentioned that in the wrong way earlier. So it says, Asanga explains in his Compendium of Knowledge that lethargy is an aspect of ignorance because it assists the other afflictions. And then there's a translation of what we just saw. What is lethargy? An unserviceable state of mind classified as a derivative of delusion. It works to assist all root afflictions and secondary afflictions. So he says the mind can be disturbed in a variety of ways. Earlier, we looked at it as a distracted or excited mind, but being too dull is another such way. In general, afflictions in the desire realm, like desire, hatred, jealousy, and so forth, are non-virtuous. However, some subtle secondary mental factors that accompany the egotistic view are neither virtuous nor non-virtuous. They are ethically neutral. So I put this in the slides as well, but this little bit here. Lethargy derives from ignorance, and in its more coarse instances is non-virtuous. So mostly what we're talking about here in terms of this affliction are the instances where it does become somewhat non-virtuous. But he says also subtle lethargy, which is a subtler state of it, is sometimes an ethically neutral obstruction. So it may not have a non-virtuous tone to it because it's happening at a subtler level in the mind. But either way, lethargy is a combination of the body and mind that feels heavy. It has no flexibility or suppleness, and without suppleness, you may need to bend, but find it to be extremely difficult. Lethargy creates a situation unsuitable for certain practices, such as shamatha. Vasubandhu's A Treasury of Knowledge, we saw that as well. What is lethargy? The heaviness of the body and the heaviness of the mind that are the unserviceability of the body and unserviceability of the mind. So when the mind is heavy, it makes the body heavy. Drowsiness renders both the mind and body unserviceable for the aims of cultivating shamatha and other goals. So he mostly puts it in the context of shamatha and the development of that, but it's not to say that lethargy also couldn't play a role in inducing other non-virtuous states, other ways of not quite being attentive and alert about what's going on. It's another factor that plays a role in our tendency to not be tending to our minds as well as what we should. So I don't know, there's these gradations that are sometimes kind of hard to pick out. When you're in meditation, it might be useful to sometimes look at these things and say, what's going on with my mind right now? Is laxity, as I said, they usually define it as something that you don't really notice so much until the mind gets a lot subtler in your meditation. And then you can begin to see that it is a lack of an intensity to the object that you're meditating on, the vividness. Actually, I brought Tsongkhapa's text here, and I'll read a little bit of what he says here. Laxity may be virtuous or ethically neutral, whereas lethargy is either a non-virtuous or ethically neutral mental obstruction. Moreover, the classic texts say that to dispel laxity, you must bring to mind pleasant objects, such as the body of the Buddha, or meditate on light so as to stimulate your mind. Therefore, you have to stop the object from appearing unclearly, as though darkness were descending on your mind, and you have to put an end to the quality of attention which has become flaccid. You need both a clear object of meditation and a tight way of apprehending the object. Neither a clear object alone nor transparency of the subject alone is enough. It is easy to recognize excitement, but laxity is hard to comprehend, since it is not clearly identified in the authoritative classic texts. It is also very important because in this case, it is a major point of misunderstanding concerning flawless concentration. Therefore, you should experience laxity with an exacting awareness, and on that basis, examine it well and identify it in accordance with Kamala Shila's stages of meditation. So again, he does share a lot more about laxity in here, but it's a much subtler state to detect, to know when we don't, because you will be on the object of meditation and you'll feel like everything's going along. This is what they say. I don't know this from personal experience, but there's a lack of an intensity and clarity to the experience. And so that has to be heightened for you to attain shamatha. And so again, laxity is happening at a much subtler level. What we're talking about here in terms of lethargy can influence that laxity, can become a cause of that laxity. But lethargy itself is its own unique mental factor that, again, can generally be non-virtuous, but does have some subtler states where it is ethically neutral. So any comments or, yeah, Bob?
Yeah, I mean, I think tricky because, again, lethargy and laziness, maybe we should wait till we get things.
Laziness is coming up soon too, yeah.
Try to distinguish. I mean, lethargy seems a little funny because, you can just be naturally tired.
Sure.
Naturally tired as far as concentrate or useful.
Yeah. So Bob was saying, yeah, that maybe when we get to laziness, we can also discern a little bit of the difference between lethargy and laziness. And then there's also, of course, there's times when the body is tired, when we do have sleepiness, drowsiness to the body. And again, the lethargy that follows in the mind, I guess, got the same flavor as that, but it is still seems to be somewhat distinct.
And also, I mean, sleepiness be a part of lethargy.
Yeah, I mean, could sleepiness be a part of lethargy? It almost seems to be, again, identified as maybe another separate factor on that continuum. Again, that if we go all the way to sleepiness, well, then eventually that ends up in sleep. And as we're going to see, sleep is also a mental factor. It's one of the 4 changeable mental factors we're going to get to at the very end of this. But it is its own, kind of thing. And so maybe, again, lethargy could be, depending upon what's happening with our lethargy, if it's sort of just hanging out or whether it's progressing into sleepiness, drowsiness, and then eventually into sleep. But those do seem to still be in the text set out as specific things.
Yeah.
But
the other thing too is a little bit hard for me.
Yeah.
You sit there and say, "Oh, I decided I'm going to be lethargic today."
Yeah. So yeah, when we say I'm going to be lethargic today, well, then there's kind of a different, and that's where there's always a problem with these English terms because they get used in a lot of different contexts. Dullness, again, as I said, that was one of them. That's also an equivalent for this. That kind of gives a different flavor. I mean, we don't use that quite as much, maybe, We wouldn't use it in the context of like you're saying, I'm going to sit around and be dull today. But it means that there's sort of, again, it's hard to find the right words for it, but heaviness is the word that they use frequently in translating this, and it is kind of that quality. So it is useful to sort of pick that apart. As I was mentioning, these 2 forces of the mind being drawn outward versus the mind being drawn inward, I would say each of us probably have a tendency in our meditation for one or the other. And we will have times when the other one will be experienced, but they're probably less frequent than one of them. And that just has to do with the nature of our mind, and even could be influenced, as it seemed to show here, in terms of our sleep, in terms of our diet, in terms of exercise, or many other things that can have a bearing on the physical body and thereby a bearing on our minds. There is an interrelationship between those. So yeah, Rowena.
I don't know whether this is a personal problem, but now that I'm trying to slow down and spend more time meditating, and I haven't gotten very deep in meditation, it's that particularly now in these winter days, when there's nothing too inspiring about getting up and moving, I have to really get a hold of myself to actually functionally meditate. Because I'll just sit there and it's kind of like vegetate, not meditate.
Right.
And it's because my mind, I'm having trouble focusing my mind. And I can focus for a short period, and then all of a sudden I just go out, and because I haven't much physical energy either, just sort of, it's kind of scaring me because I'm getting older, and all of a sudden just sort of flatlining, and I didn't used to do that because I kept a higher metabolism going.
Right.
And now that I don't have to, don't know, sometimes I just get up and do my exercises or something, and then try and sit down again, but I can see lethargy as being like a seeping out, due to a seeping out of energy, and you're not monitoring properly.
So Rowena was talking about her own experiences in especially on these cold winter days of getting to that more engaged state and the difficulties that you face in that. But just kind of this idea of it being sort of like a seeping out is the term that you used, of
Like,
the energy to sort of being more diffuse and not. It is, yeah. I mean, and it,
it's really highly visible.
yeah. I mean, and it is quite interesting that when we talk about, to tie it to physical energy, when we talk about pliancy, which we saw in the virtuous mental factors, it was there also that we had a serviceability of the body and the mind. And it was in conjunction, and that's when you have it fully qualified at the state of shamatha, of calm abiding, is when you no longer have any of this heaviness or laziness or anything that would be a deterrent, because you have a complete serviceability of the body and mind. So what we're dealing with in terms of, I'm not just speaking to you, Rowena, but all of us in terms of our own daily lives, is how to utilize what's going on with us in terms of our bodies, our minds, our lives, to try to find a way of overcoming some of those things in terms of our more formal practice. But I think, as I was mentioning earlier, it's definitely in the context of meditation that this becomes problematic, but it's also during our day. To what extent are we going around and not being as, because this will also feed into how alert and attentive and engaged we are in practicing virtue throughout our day. So I think lethargy is definitely more prominent or noticeable when it's on the cushion, but it's also a factor during our other hours. Yeah. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, I mean, one thing you said is talking about clients.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe another way of looking at some of these factors, right? Wrap your mind around, is actually asking what is the opposite.
Right, right.
For example, laziness, the opposite of that.
It's effort, or yeah.
So, but lethargy, the opposite. The energy probably.
Yeah. So, but yeah. So Bob was just mentioning that maybe one useful way to examine some of these is to see what's their opposite, and we saw that even with shame, non-shame, and non-embarrassment, and so on. But with this one, what is the opposite of lethargy? I mean, at the full extreme, it would be pliancy. It would be the ability for us to have complete serviceability of our body and minds, to no longer have any issues with that, no heaviness or anything. And then what were you saying, Rachel, about excitement?
Well, I was just saying that, in a sense, that it depends on how you say it's opposite, but excitement is its opposite as well, in a different.
Yeah, I mean, if we stay in the vein of what is, non-virtuous, excitement being, yeah, I mean, I suppose.
How about
Focus? Energize? Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of terms that we could say. If you had an absence of this and a full presence of what would be the opposite, again, and that depends on whether we're talking about opposite as being something that is virtuous and wholesome versus something that is still in the non-virtuous category but has a different tone, like excitement, then I would say, that some of these qualities definitely would be a part of that pliancy. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, but with laxity, excitement.
Well, yeah. I mean, again, but yeah, I don't know. These get into really fine points around some of these. Bob was saying, well, wouldn't laxity be the object of excitement at the level of talking about two different non-virtuous or potentially problematic states that keep us off of our meditation object? But yeah, I don't know. Again, lethargy being kind of in the continuum, being a cause of laxity, I think we can probably still safely say that excitement or something in that vein would be, but yeah, we're in this category, this section where we're looking at a lot of these that really are, instrumental in our meditation and being addressed so that they don't become problematic. But also even in terms of our practice, things like non-faith and non-conscientiousness, forgetfulness, non-introspection. These are all things that, once more, I mean, as we go through these, we'll see that these are things that we need to be combating all the time, to make sure that they're not more prominent in our minds, because otherwise we don't take full advantage of what this life has to offer. We don't do the practice we need to do. We don't live according to the principles we want to live by. So there's a lot of ways that these things can be applied. But obviously these few that we're going to look at that do have to do with meditation, such as lethargy, excitement, laziness, even non-faith and non-conscientiousness, like I said, they do apply to some degree. Forgetfulness, certainly. So distraction. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting. When we get to distraction, we'll see that, again, not all distraction is non-virtuous necessarily. What makes distraction non-virtuous would be something more specific. But so we'll go through all of these, but again, in terms of lethargy, let me go to Geshe Rabtin's slides and we'll see what he says. And it's not that extensive or, hugely different, but at least be able to kind of do that, and then we can discuss together anything else that we want to before we move on. So again, lethargy in that text in Mind and Its Functions was called dullness. Dullness is a mental factor that, having caused the mind to lapse into darkness and thereby become insensitive, does not comprehend its object clearly as it is. It has the function of making the mind and body heavy and inflexible, and of increasing sleepiness and sinking. And sinking is the term that in this text I believe is being used for laxity. We saw it being differentiated a little bit in Geshe Sopa's thing, but I think in this text it's saying that it does have the tendency to either go in the one direction of sleepiness, which is a coarser form, or potentially even giving rise to some level of sinking or laxity when we're in a subtler state. Dullness should not be confused with sinking. The latter only occurs in the more advanced states of mental quiescence meditation and is not necessarily an affliction. This is what we saw also with Geshe Sopa's commentary. When the body and mind are light and joyful, sinking manifests as a decrease in one's mental energy, somewhat akin to air escaping through a tiny hole in a balloon. So that's that subtler thing that we call laxity, which again is like that the energy isn't quite all there, even though you might be quite focused on the object. You think you're holding the meditation object quite prominently in your mind, but the energy is lower. There's a decrease in the mental energy. Then he goes on to say, as we saw in Geshe Sopa's commentary, that there are two kinds of dullness, one that's gross and one that's subtle. So dullness or lethargy does seem to have a grosser form that, again, Geshe Sopa said was non-virtuous in nature. And then it's a subtler version that can be neutral ethically. So this is, again, just to keep that in mind. These are the lines I read from Geshe Sopa's text, just that one little passage. Lethargy, again, derives from ignorance, and in its more coarse instances, it is non-virtuous. Subtle lethargy is sometimes an ethically neutral obstruction. Either way, lethargy is a combination of the body and mind that feels heavy. It has no flexibility or suppleness. So again, maybe, and I would assume that, the more that you develop your attention to things, and the easier it is to distinguish these things in your mind and to know when there is laxity arising versus something that's heavier. What we tend to probably know now that is a sort of dullness or heaviness to the mind is probably falling in this category. Whereas when we have fine-tuned our meditation and maybe are on, I don't know which of the mental abidings it is, somewhere around the fifth or sixth, when you begin to notice laxity and have to counteract it at a coarser level and then at a subtler level, because it's also in two different gradations, then eventually you are able to remove that. But you have to be able to see it at that time. And it is much harder to see because you no longer have lethargy involved in a grosser way, in the way that it's, this dullness or heaviness of the mind. You're staying with the meditation object and think everything is hunky-dory, but it isn't. So I don't know if there's any more to say on any of this from anyone. I can't say I have perfect understanding of this. There wasn't a lot of commentary in any of the other FPMT teachers' commentaries. It seemed that Venerable George, when he got to these last mental factors, he was in a bit of a hurry and didn't talk quite as extensively about each of them. I don't think so. I don't think so at all. But anyway, Bob said he was lethargic. But just joking. I think a lot of you met Venerable George when he was here, yes? I had a chance, actually, I'd never met him, so I came into the center to get something, and he was here. Let me just pull up his commentary and make sure that I am... yeah, he says, dullness or lethargy is not the main fault in tranquil abiding, which is mental sinking. Sinking itself is when you either lose the clarity of the object, it sort of becomes dull, it doesn't become clear, or you lose the grasp of that, you lose the intensity of the clarity. So that's the way it's usually talked about, and whether it's coarse or subtle, laxity has to do with either of those factors, you know. So the coarser one is not having the clarity, the subtler one is not having the intensity. These are just words to put on it. Again, you'd have to be in that space of having that meditative experience to really know, I would think, you know, how that manifests. So he says that's sinking, the main fault. Dullness or lethargy is a little bit grosser and can induce sinking. Sleepiness is different from sinking also. So he does delineate those two, like I was saying earlier. Lethargy, mukpa, makes the mind kind of dull. Mukpa means dark or cloudy. So I don't know, he goes on to talk a little bit more, but I think that's probably the gist of what he says. So shall we move on then? Let's go ahead and talk about excitement, which is usually delineated as one of the two main obstacles to developing shamatha in terms of the two things that need to be addressed, two faults in the mind that need to be addressed. And again, the other one was laxity that we just talked about in the context of lethargy. It says there regarding excitement, this is page 77, Asanga's Compendium of Knowledge says, what is excitement? It is an unpeacefulness of mind that subsequently engages an attractive cause. It has the function of hindering calm abiding. Of course, it also gets us into a lot of other trouble. It's not to say that it's, you know, that's its only function, but that's how it's normally talked about in the context of our practice. So just as it has been said above, it is an awareness that, upon observing the attributes of the desire realm previously experienced, mentally scatters outwards to them and engages them with craving. So this was the one that, again, if we go to our sheet, it's the last one that we have that's derived solely from attachment. It is a mind of desire, craving, that is scattering outwards towards these objects. And of course, again, when in the meditation session, it becomes very problematic. It is our tendency to sit there and think about all kinds of delightful things that we would have experienced in the past and that we would rather be experiencing in the present, or in some way inducing that kind of desire. So regarding this, the Precious Garland again says, let's read these two lines. Excitement is an unpeacefulness of the body and mind. So it's interesting that excitement is even related here to the body in that context. I couldn't find any commentary that extensive on that. But obviously we know that when we have a feeling of craving or desire arising at that level that we might call excitement, that there's usually some physical component to it. And oftentimes we are dealing with sense objects, which are physical in their in the what they do for us. They stimulate the senses in the body, the 5 physical senses. So it says, likewise, a discussion of the 5 aggregates also says, what is excitement? It is an unpeacefulness of mind. So it's kind of interesting. That's a very brief definition of it. You don't have all of the things that Asanga said, an unpeacefulness of mind that subsequently engages an attractive cause and so on. So then also this is discussed extensively in the Lamrim Chenmo. Lama Tsongkhapa there says, its object of observation is a pleasant and attractive object. Its subjective aspect is an unpeacefulness of the mind that is scattered outward and is involved with attachment. So as I was saying earlier, this is a specific mind that is part of that force in our meditation that draws us outward. Now you can be drawn to other things that are not these objects of attachment, and we're going to talk about that in a moment, but the idea is that this is a specific one that is non-virtuous, is an afflictive state of mind because it is driven by attachment. It's driven by craving for something that we aren't experiencing at the moment that we would like to experience. So thus it engages its object with the aspect of craving. It has the function of hindering the mind from abiding on the object of observation. So when we are trying to meditate on the breath or meditate on the image of a Buddha, for example, then if the mind of excitement is arising, then obviously we're following that. We're not with the object that we are intended to be meditating upon. So the qualm is raised here in our text are all outward scatterings of the mind excitement, because we might talk about scattering or wandering, the tendency of the mind to not stay put but to be off somewhere. And the response that our author gives is, I do not hold it to be so. Excitement is involved with attachment, but the mind is frequently distracted to objects by way of afflictions other than attachment. And the mind even scatters to non-afflicted virtuous objects of observation. So you can be sitting there in meditation, and maybe it's not excitement that's causing you like an attachment. You might have anger arising because you're recalling somebody who harmed you in the past, and that is being outward wandering, scattering of the mind. So you could have it in regard to some other non-virtuous state. But you could also have it in regard to a virtuous thing. You might be sitting there meditating, and suddenly you start thinking about compassion towards sentient beings or some virtuous object. Well, that is a wandering of the mind, because that's not what you're there to meditate on. You're not meditating on the compassion. You're meditating on your object of observation at that time, the object of observation that you're using to develop calm abiding, which again could be an image of a Buddha or the breath or some other object. There are many, countless objects that we could be using. So hence, he says, not all scatterings of the mind are excitement. So we don't use this term excitement in this context for anything but something that is derived from attachment, that is a form of craving. Okay. Any comments so far? Questions? Yeah, Stephen.
Yeah, so that's very clear. You laid it out very clearly. I guess I'm struggling a little bit, but why the distinction?
Why the distinction?
Yeah. Because anytime the mind is scattered, well, that kind of takes away our stability and our placement. So why here do they subcategorize it to just objects?
I guess again, yeah. In the context of what are being called so Stephen's question is, why here do they only talk about it being related to attachment, whereas it could be related, mental wandering could be related to other non-virtuous states, could also be related to virtuous states. I don't know. I mean, again, I would say that they do talk about it in the text where we go into how to attain shamatha and calm abiding. They certainly don't leave it out entirely, but nonetheless, I would say that probably, again, it's because it tends to be the more common thing that happens when people have gotten into a meditation practice, that the tendency of the mind to wander with attachment is probably much greater, perhaps because some of the coarser levels of afflictions have been diminished to some degree, but I don't know. I couldn't answer that. I've never heard an answer from any of my teachers on that. I don't know that anyone else in the room has.
Speculate that, well, if it's based on attachment, then that's specific antidotes for attachment. Hobbies with attachment. So it's categorized that way because it makes it easier for us to fix.
So Stephen was speculating that maybe we have it presented here as excitement related to attachment because there are antidotes to attachment that could be applied, making it easier to fix. I think we also have antidotes to the other afflictions too, though, so certainly with regard to them. But nonetheless, I mean, again, attachment is also one of the subtler, in terms of it's much easier to identify when anger is arising, versus attachment tends to be, because of its pleasing nature, because it's after objects that give us that pleasurable feeling, that happy feeling, we tend to not kind of highlight them so much. The stop sign doesn't come out quite as soon. The stop sign comes out soon when often, once you develop some awareness of your mind, when the mind starts going down the pathway of anger, because we can tell it so much more. But when we're following attachment, sometimes it's not so quick. But yeah, Bob, and then Rowena.
Yeah, I think, what occurs to me here is that
Yeah.
So for us, we want to clearly delineate what isn't an affliction.
Sure.
So being able to distinguish just from the virtuous mental wandering, something that is a true affliction.
Right. Right. Yeah. In terms of that, Bob was just pointing out, in terms of the virtuous mental wandering, well, here we're talking about secondary affliction, so we wouldn't necessarily, that wouldn't be included. That isn't an affliction. To have the mind wandering to a virtuous object isn't an affliction. It's a problem, an obstacle to meditation. But nonetheless, if we talk about the ones where we are wandering to other non-virtuous states, well, then obviously those are obstacles and they are afflictions. So it would be, yeah. But in the traditional texts, they don't talk about those as much. And again, excitement and laxity are always pointed out as the two main obstacles to meditation, to calm abiding. So there's obviously some importance in looking at those that derive from attachment compared to those that mental wanderings that arise from anger or jealousy or other things. So again, my guess is because that will included in the
sort of mental wandering,
right.
Due to anger and so forth, maybe actually sort of included
Yeah. Yeah. So Bob's just saying perhaps the mental wandering that would be due to anger or other things would be included in those, some of the other things that are derivative from them or even them themselves. So I suppose, but it is interesting that this one, which is really just a form of attachment, so if we really boil it down to what is excitement, excitement is attachment, it's craving. It's not ever delineated as being something else other than in the context of when it becomes an obstacle to our meditation, to the mind staying calm and focused. So I don't know. I mean, it gets to be, I assume once more, because once more, we're not talking about an exhaustive list of the contents of our minds. That's never been the premise for these 51 mental factors. These are ones that are highlighted because of the role that they either play in inducing us to practice well or becoming problems for us practicing well. And so, to have that expectation that we're going to end up with everything on the list that could potentially play that role, I don't know if that's valid, but it is interesting that it's how it's. Let's see what Rowena had to say, and then back to Rachel.
Very well, thank you. When I'm watching how my mind gets attachment, and there's a thing about letting go of the conceptualized self versus other people, self, everything else. And this is this huge sticker toy mess of everything being stuck with everything else. You have, and you could be just watching your attachment.
Right.
And it's not necessarily, that's not necessarily a bad activity, but it's just, there's so much of it. I mean, it's the way you work. And so it gets kind of discouraging, and it seems like,
right.
And so you just have to chill. I mean, that's why you quiet down. But I'm not very advanced in the quieting down part.
So Rowena was just pointing out from her experience that, there's just an awful lot of the attachment, and the more that you kind of investigate, the more you see how it plays a role and is manifesting in a variety of ways.
It's almost part of the way your mind works at a very conventional level. I mean, it just goes from little here, little there, around,
right.
Whatever it is.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I often talk about it being our default mode. This is really where we're coming from, is always some sense of craving, some sense of desiring something to satisfy. But yeah, Rachel, what were you going to share? Anything?
It's similar to what you said. I think, the question of why do they do it is something to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Because then we are thinking about it.
Right.
And by thinking about it, then we're more aware of what's going on while we're trying to do these kinds of things, like concentrate on an object in meditation. And it's the whole point is to become more and more aware of what's going on.
Right.
So just that most of us don't go around making that distinction. Is it virtuous, non-virtuous, or ethically neutral?
Right.
We don't even think that way. And so then if we're thinking that way, and why did they do it? Well, that's the perfect answer to why they do it.
So Rachel was just pointing out that there's a purpose in the fact that we're sitting here discussing it, that there's some merit to that, because the more that we think about that, the more that we are actually engaging in the process and really looking at what's to be found. I mean, another thing that came to mind to me as we were going through and discussing all of this was the fact that one of the big problems they say that in our meditation as well is that we can become quite attached to the feeling that comes with meditation, the peacefulness, the joy or whatever that we experience on the basis of the mind calming down. So maybe this is also to highlight to us that, not to have any sort of attachment arising as best as we can in regard to any pleasurable experiences, while the experiences we have for meditation become much more internal and are not stimulated by outside sense objects. There's a potential, I suppose, to have that same attachment arise. It's not, I don't know if it's technically what we would call excitement, but perhaps again that's why excitement is highlighted, because we have to be very vigilant in paying attention to attachment in particular. Otherwise it becomes an obstacle to recognizing that the meditation isn't the goal. Meditation is the means to attain the goal. And so if we get attached to the means and don't really recognize what it's supposed to be doing, which is to remove all of the attachment, be rid of all the attachment, then we've defeated the purpose of our meditation. Oh, I don't know. And there's another thing that maybe is part of it, but let's go through Geshe Rabtin's slides, what I've extracted from Mind and Its Functions. So again, they use the same term. Stephen Batchelor used excitement as well, and that is very common. I don't know, I haven't really seen any other translation equivalents for this. It's a mental factor that, through the force of attachment, does not allow the mind to rest solely upon a wholesome object, but scatters it here and there to many other objects. It has the principal function of obstructing mental quiescence, which is the term used for calm abiding shamatha. Also, this is kind of an interesting one, it causes the mind to engage in uncontrolled fantasy and frivolity. Everyone likes frivolity, right?
Sometimes it really does seem rather frivolous. So what's going on in your head? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Not a bad word.
Maybe there would be people who are quite, I don't know, I'm not an artistic person. I'm not that, that side of me is not as well developed, but maybe they would not want to lose this ability to engage in uncontrolled fantasy and frivolity. But anyway, this, pardon? Yeah, yeah.
In both the aspect where it's the negative or danger as well as fear,
Uh-huh.
that we're not realistic about what's going on. We amplify a little bit more and then a little bit more, and then we're a bit away, and
Sure.
seeing ourselves and whatever,
Yeah.
It's easy to slide.
So Alex was just saying, yeah, that it is true that it's easy to slide into fantasy when we follow these minds of excitement or mental wandering with regard to other delusions or whatever, and to get very far away from reality. So it's interesting that Geshe Rabtin says this mental factor is often with us, but its presence only becomes truly felt when we start to concentrate the mind in meditation. That's why I was saying earlier that it is highlighted that its function is to get in the way and be a hindrance to our mental quiescence or calm abiding, but it's not to say that it doesn't play a role in our daily lives as in terms of the excitement that is there. But again, this is the role that it plays in particular that is being highlighted here when we are developing the mind on that continuum towards calm abiding. So not all forms of mental distraction are caused by excitement. Only those that are brought about by our attachment to or desire for an agreeable contaminated object. So again, and going back to the comment I made about in meditation, you can get quite attached to even the bliss, the peace that comes with that. That's still a contaminated object. It's only a samsaric experience. It hasn't yet been united with the wisdom realizing emptiness. So there are two kinds of excitement. In Geshe Rabtin's presentation, he highlights that there's a gross level and a subtle level. Oftentimes in the meditation instruction, it says the grosser level is very easy to identify because it's what happens when, we're off in la-la land having all kinds of fantasies or experiences. But they said that oftentimes the other one, the subtler level, is sort of like the water flowing underneath ice. in the winter, you know, the top of the river may be frozen and look very solid, but the water is still flowing underneath. So this can be a pattern in the mind where we're still being drawn to these objects of excitement, but at a subtler level. So it seems like we're still quite there in a solid mind with the object being focused on, but there's a subtler distraction that's happening towards these objects of desire. Yeah, Rowena, were you?
I'm just observing by own observations of how this is, it's because it's like water, it's moving,
Right.
and you're so used to it moving, you just would tap it down, but it doesn't go away. You know, it's sort of always
Yeah.
seems to be there. I just haven't meditated enough, so I haven't got that.
Well, and I think that's true for all of us. At least I could say it's true for me. But, you know, so Rowena was just saying that, yeah, it is kind of like water sort of always flowing, and haven't yet experienced that not being there at all at some level. But that, I think, does come with time. And again, the instructions of going through the 9 mental abidings and arriving at calm abiding. At that point, you know, then you certainly don't have any excitement or laxity present at all. You've completely calmed them. They are not there. The mind's undistracted. Again, thinking of how it was said earlier, that both of those are distractions, laxity and excitement.
All I
Yeah.
can do is just let it flow. I'm not gonna tap
Yeah.
it, just
Well,
ups or downs,
yeah.
the motion or the pace or anything else. It's
Yeah.
there.
And that's a good practice, is to let it flow, like you're saying. I mean, not to get caught up in it, though, not to follow it everywhere that it's going, not to, you know, be totally engrossed in it. You know, and that's where it's manifesting most for us. And then again, you don't get to the subtler level of excitement on your, you know, stages of developing the mind until further along, and then you begin to detect that that's going on under the surface. So let me just repeat the chart that we've seen before. This actually will come up again a little bit later, either tonight or in the next session. When we talk about laziness, I think is where I put that, or even non-faith, you could talk about this. But recall that there were 5 faults that are identified as existing to whether we are able to develop calm abiding or not, and then the 8 antidotes. And essentially, the third line on the 5 faults has the non-identification of laxity and excitement. So these 2 that we just talked about a little bit, laxity in the context of lethargy and excitement now, these will arise in the mind. And if we don't identify them, that's one of these faults, that we actually are allowing them to be in the mind and not being clued into their presence. That requires the factor of introspection. Now, introspection is kind of interesting. It is talked about frequently as a part of our minds that we need to utilize in our meditation, but it's not one of the 51 mental factors. I think, again, I read somewhere, I can't remember where this was, that it's included in the mental factor of intelligence. But nonetheless, it is said to be like a spy in the corner of the mind that's checking in to see what's the quality of our meditation. And if we see that there is laxity there, or that there is excitement there, then we apply an antidote. Well, if we don't apply the antidote, that's the next fault. The non-application means that you might have identified it there, but you aren't doing anything to address it. You aren't changing your quality of your mind and meditation so that you have overcome it. So the antidote at that time is application. Apply the antidote. And the antidotes to these, again, we talk about them frequently in grosser forms when we introduce meditation. When we have that tendency for the mind to wander outwards, we need to try to calm the mind a bit, to not have that distraction arising in that form. Try to bring the mind down a bit even. Sometimes it's advisable to meditate on more sobering topics first so that we don't have such excitement towards all these sense objects. Also to try to watch the extent to which we have maybe made the body into a state where excitement is more prone to rise, versus laxity, you know, that may be a heaviness to the body that we are inducing. So there are ways that we can adjust for these physically by applying antidotes, but we can also fine-tune the mind a bit to be able to reestablish our meditation on the object. And then, of course, the last fault, I'm just going to talk about these 3 faults, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, is if we're over-applying. And that doesn't happen until further down the road. And that's where we think we need to apply an antidote to overcome excitement, for example, but we don't need to. And so we're kind of doing something that doesn't need to be done. It's like throwing more water on the coals when the fire is already out. You don't need to do it anymore. Better just to leave it be. And so in this case, you practice equanimity. And equanimity here isn't that immeasurable equanimity that we often talk about. It is the mind being able to stay in a state of balance, of not doing something. And then you stay with that meditation on the object, and your mind becomes more and more focused, greater and greater equanimity. But you have to apply the antidote of equanimity at those times when you're over applying the antidotes. So laxity and excitement, just to talk about those and kind of how they play a role in obstructing our calm abiding, and how we overcome them with introspection, application, and equanimity. Any comments? Okay. Let's go on. It's about almost 8 o'clock. We have some time to continue and do at least non-faith. Maybe we even get to laziness tonight, but non-faith is the next of the 15th. If we go to our little cheat sheet, this is one that we go back to ignorance. This is related to ignorance, derives from ignorance. So the Compendium of Knowledge says, what is non-faith? It is a non-conviction, non-clarity, and non-wishing of the mind. Does everyone remember how where those three, they're here as nons, but the opposite of those, conviction, clarity, and wishing, those were the three components of faith, when we looked at faith as the first of our 11 virtuous mental factors. So here it's a non-conviction, a non-clarity, and non-wishing of the mind with respect to virtuous phenomena, and is involved with ignorance. It has the function of acting as a support for laziness. So there is a little footnote there, but it's not so relevant. It has to do with the Tibetan text being amended in accordance with a different meaning that made more sense. So just as it has been said above, it is the discordant class of faith. Again, we saw faith back on like pages 32 and 33 of our text. If you want to go back and look at those later tonight or tomorrow, whenever, might be useful to review those. But we had, again, three kind of components of faith. This idea of a faith of conviction, a faith of clarity, and a faith of aspiration or wishing, a wishing faith. So we're going to see those three being opposed here. So we have first the non-faith of non-conviction in actions and their results being, in reality, and so forth, all the various things that are taught by the Buddha. The discordant class of the faith of conviction. So again, faith of conviction is the idea that we become much more convinced, even convinced faith is sometimes a term for this, of the Buddha's teachings as we practice them more, as we gain more experience. And so we have a greater and greater faith arising on the basis of that. Non-faith of non-clarity and a mental dislike with respect to the possessors of excellent qualities, such as the three jewels, the discordant class of the faith of clarity. So the faith of clarity is when we are able to see something like the three jewels and clearly discern their qualities and have faith on the basis of that. It's kind of that clear view of things that we are able to be inspired by. And so here you don't have that, and you even have a mental dislike with respect to the possessors of excellent qualities. So you've kind of moved in the opposite direction. You don't have any conviction from the first one in the law of karma and so on. You don't even have any sort of clear view of the qualities of these beings and the three jewels. Instead, you even are adhering to some false view of them as being inferior. And then finally, the third, the non-faith of non-wishing and non-seeking of liberation and so forth, the discordant class of wishing faith. Wishing faith is how faith manifests in terms of causing us to aspire to achieve particular results, to actually engage in the path. It's somewhat akin to aspiration, but it's a virtuous state of mind that is definitely about faith. Let's just pop back to faith for just a moment. Again, it was pages 32 and 33 in our text. I'll just read real quickly the definition of faith there, and you'll see those terms repeated. It is a conviction, clarity, and wishing with respect to an existent, something that exists that the Buddha taught as such, that is endowed with excellent qualities and power. It has the function of acting as a support for aspiration. So it is on the foundation of faith that we then engage, we have an aspiration, a tendency to move in a particular direction, and then we put effort into doing that. So there's that hierarchy, which we saw actually even in the antidotes to laziness, right? That it begins with faith. On the basis of faith, we have aspiration. On the basis of aspiration, we have effort, enthusiasm, and then on the basis of that, we actually gain pliancy, which is the final antidote to laziness in terms of the development of calm abiding. So anyway, you can review on your own the descriptions that are there on the next page in particular in regard to clarifying faith, faith of conviction, wishing faith. But this is the exact opposite of this. This is the, as Bob was saying earlier, it's useful to see, what they are opposed to. In this case, it's quite clear. Non-faith being the exact opposite of faith. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, in the sense that these three different categories are actually three different types of faith.
Uh-huh.
So in that sense, I guess we would also have to say that this non-faith comes in three different types. So it's not that non-faith includes all of these
Right.
characteristics, but you have actually three different types, each with this characteristic.
It seems such. Bob was pointing out that just as we talked about having three different types of faith in the context of the virtuous mental factor faith, we would be most likely then talking about three different types of non-faith that you wouldn't. And it is weird because the language all says and, it says non-conviction, non-clarity, and non-wishing, which makes it sound like you have to have all three present there. But I don't know if that's the case. I agree with you. I think it seems like you could have it manifesting with one of them. I would think that they feed the other, and you would probably, just be talking about different aspects of it. But faith itself, or non-faith itself, would be, that state of mind that is occurring on the basis of the conviction, the wishing, the clarity, or the opposite of those that we're seeing here. Just one more sentence for this. It is simply to be understood that its function is as stated above. It's a support for laziness. So we talk about non-faith in the context of it giving rise to laziness, which is interesting, again, because the antidote, as I said, the first antidote to laziness on our chart was faith. That is actually how we begin to overcome our laziness, is by having some faith in the conviction, the clarity, the belief, the aspiration that allows us to fully engage then, and we're no longer under the sway of laziness. Now, we haven't even talked about laziness yet, so it's a little strange in that regard to be going into that. But let's go back to the chart. I'll share this with the folks at home now. And we do see there that laziness is the fault that faith overcomes. And these four are meant to be in a bit of a hierarchy, faith being the foundation. From faith, aspiration arises. From aspiration, effort arises. From effort, eventually, pliancy arises. Pliancy, once more, is that what occurs in the fully qualified state of calm abiding, when you are no longer on the mental abidings leading there, but you have actually attained a fully qualified state. And so we talked about pliancy in the context of the virtuous mental factors. We talked about effort there, and we talked about faith. Aspiration wasn't talked about in the virtuous mental factors because it's one of our 5 object-determining mental factors. But this is obviously a virtuous state of mind in this context because it is aspiration for the attainment of shamatha, calm abiding, aspiration for attaining these mental states and all the qualities that will arise on the basis of that. So let's look at non-faith as it's described in Geshe Rabtin's book, Mind and Its Functions. And the term that was used there was faithlessness. It's kind of a strange word, but faithlessness is a mental factor that, since it causes one to have no belief in or respect for that which is worthy of confidence, such as the law of actions and their results, is the complete opposite of faith. It has the function of acting as the basis for laziness and of causing the power of faith to decrease. So whatever faith we do have, it takes the air out of that, it deflates that, and it can certainly induce us to have more laziness in the variety of ways that laziness manifests. So it is interesting that the Geshe Rabtin doesn't go to the degree of delineating 3. They're kind of in there to some degree. And it says no belief in, that's obviously the believing or aspiring. Respect for that which is worthy of confidence, that's kind of like the clarity. I don't know, I mean, it's hard for me to put that framework on what Geshe-Rabten says. In addition, he says, it makes one disbelieve, disrespect, and have no desire for that which is positive, thus severing the roots of any wholesome development. So here it's a little bit clearer. Disbelief, I almost want to relate that more to the lack of a conviction. Disrespect would be the lack of clarity, and having no desire for that which is positive would be like the lack of wishing or aspiring. But it's hard to, because again, he didn't delineate it quite in that way. So it severs the roots of any wholesome development. Lack of faith or non-faith or faithlessness plays that role. There are two forms of faithlessness. This was kind of interesting because again, this isn't in our text. That which simply does not see the need for or the fruits of virtue, and that which regards virtue either mistakenly or as non-existent. So again, this is, I don't know where that comes from. I don't have any other commentary on it. So we just have to leave it on the face value there, as seems that there can be two ways that this faithlessness manifests, that you're not even seeing the need for virtue, or that you're regarding virtue mistakenly or as non-existent, that there isn't such a thing as virtue. By virtue, we would mean, something that would have the ability to produce results that are virtuous and so on. Something that would fall into the schema of how the Buddha taught virtue. So that's it. That's all that he wrote about it. And I don't know that there's much more I can share on that. Maybe any final comments or questions on that? Let me introduce laziness. At least we have about 5 minutes to talk about that. There's not much in our text. Maybe we can even get through it. But laziness is defined here in the Compendium of Knowledge as a non-enthusiasm of the mind engendered by the comfort of lying down, reclining on one side, and slouching about, and is involved with ignorance. It has the function of hindering application to the class of virtue. So it's kind of what keeps you from moving in the direction of engaging fully in virtue, what will lead to good results for yourself, for others as well. So just as it has been said above, it is a non-enthusiasm of the mind for virtue due to a habit of lying down and so forth. So it's kind of interesting. The ones that are talked about here tend to be more in the line of only one of the different types of laziness that are often discussed. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, it was interesting. If you look, it really does seem the opposite of effort.
Mm-hmm.
Because effort begins with who's a mind that's enthusiastic.
Yeah.
So it's either enthusiastic or not.
Yeah. So Bob was just pointing out how, we can see that laziness is definitely the opposite of enthusiasm or effort, which is the mind that you just read a passage from the
Yeah, it's mind that's
back on.
enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Basically for accomplishment.
Yeah, the mind that is enthusiastic for accomplishing virtue. So laziness, we did look at laziness in the context of that virtuous mental factor, and we already had defined, I think our author had already given us the definition of the 3 different types of laziness, but we'll mention them in the slides again. But laziness causes, it says here in our text, the entire class of virtue to degenerate. The close placement of mindfulness says, the one basis for afflictions is laziness. Who has it? Wherever laziness is present, all dharma is absent. So we can really see that, this is one of the big factors we have to be really vigilant in overcoming, and, be very clear about when it is arising and what to do to address it. It's not to say that, again, we won't have times when we need to rest or we need to relinquish the work to some degree, but we have to be very careful about making sure that we're not buying into these mental states that are a part of laziness. So let's look at Geshe-Rabten's. I think we got time to do that. It's 8:12 according to clock here. All right. Laziness, Geshe-Rabten says, is a mental factor that, having firmly grasped an object offering temporary happiness, either does not want to do anything wholesome, or although wanting to, is faint-hearted. It has the function of causing the power of enthusiasm to decrease. It acts as a basis for the degeneration of wholesome tendencies already amassed as well as for the prevention of any fresh production of virtue. So it doesn't allow what you have cultivated to grow and develop, and it doesn't allow any new virtue to be produced. So it only degenerates our practice. This negative mental factor is what is overcome by enthusiasm. Its three major divisions have already been explained in the section dealing with enthusiasm, and that was so for Geshe-Rabten as well as for our text. So I thought it would be good to review them using another text, and that's using Jeffrey Hopkins from Meditation on Emptiness. So he says, laziness is of three types. One, indolence through attachment to sleep and so forth. So that was interesting that our text kind of highlighted those sorts of things, right? The slouching about and the wanting to lie down, to recline, you know, the winter weather kind of stuff. Number two, adhering to non-virtuous activities of desire and so forth. So this is what I sometimes call this the laziness of busyness, you know, that we get really quite attached to all the other stuff we're doing that is all mundane when it comes down to it. When we're spending a lot of time and energy doing all this stuff, and it becomes an obstacle to engaging in more virtue, particularly engaging in meditation, because all of our energy goes out to those things we're attached to, you know, making sure that we do all of those things. A sense of inadequacy is said to be the worst of these three types of laziness, thinking, I cannot do this. Sometimes this is called the laziness of self-defeatism or self-denigration, that somehow we think that we're the case that will never make it to the, you know, achieving calm abiding. We're the case that will never become a Buddha. We're the case that will never, somehow we're isolating ourselves and thinking we don't have the ability to do this. We can't practice in this way. Where in reality we all can, it just takes a concerted effort. Thus, laziness is not just a sluggishness, but also the factor of enthusiasm for the afflictions, which is again what we saw in the second one, as well as a false sense of inadequacy. So Jeffrey Hopkins goes on to say the three types of laziness cause procrastination and are overcome through faith, aspiration, exertion or effort, and pliancy, which once more goes back to the four that we saw on the chart. That's the first of our five faults, because that is where most of us are at, you know, is that we are trying to still overcome the tendency that we have to have these different types of laziness in our lives. And each of us, again, will probably have a variation on those three. So it begins with faith. It begins with, again, that conviction, that clarity, that aspiration to actually see that there's great benefits to achieving calm abiding, to know that this is a path that we can have some conviction in to actually accomplish it. Then we aspire to do so. We put the effort into it. We make sure that we get on our cushion and do the work. And then eventually we will achieve pliancy, which is kind of interesting. I always point this out, that laziness isn't really completely overcome until we get to pliancy, until we actually have that. So it's not to say that it probably will not be manifest so much when we get to higher levels of meditation. But pliancy is what puts an end to it once and for all. You'll never have any of that laziness arising. The only one that I haven't talked about on the sheet here tonight in terms of these five faults is the second one, then, forgetting the instruction. And the instruction is to stay on the object. And so we discussed this in the context of mindfulness, that mindfulness is the factor. It's also one of the object determining mental factors, or object ascertaining. So it's not virtuous in its very nature, but when it is with a mind of virtue that is got faith and all these other factors present, then it does become virtuous. So mindfulness is the holding to, the not forgetting the object that we are meditating on. That's the instruction. Instruction here sounds kind of fancy, but the instruction is stay with the object. And so if we stay with the object and are mindful of the object, then we don't forget the object. We don't forget that instruction. There's one more slide from Geshe-Rabten, and then we can conclude for tonight. It says, however, in addition to these divisions, we can add three more. And again, I don't have any other commentary on these. These are just what were in Geshe-Rabten's book. Laziness that from the very outset regards the practice of Dharma as unnecessary. I mean, maybe again, that almost sounds like a non-faith in a sense or something. You don't really have any, why practice the Dharma? Not such a big deal. The second one is procrastinating laziness, which, although realizing that one is able to practice Dharma, considers there to be no time now. You know, this might be one that, you know, some of us adhere to, fall into that pit of laziness. Number 3, destructive laziness, which, although seeing the necessity of practicing now, is attracted to unwholesome activity. So we can kind of see these as 3 points in time, perhaps, that at first we might have a laziness that doesn't really see why we have to do this. You know, maybe when we first started our practice, we were kind of like, oh, all these people going on retreat and doing all these things, you know, there must be an easier way to do this. We didn't really see it as necessary. And then maybe we kind of get to see that it's necessary and that we can do it, but we still put things off. And then we go even to a greater extreme and get quite attached to a lot of unwholesome activity that isn't really going to fulfill the aims that we are trying to accomplish. So I don't know, I thought that was kind of interesting, but like I said, I don't have any other real commentary on those. I've never seen them presented in any other context around laziness. So. All right. Any final comments, questions, criticisms? All right. So we got up through laziness. Next time we will start with non-conscientiousness. We are moving into the last bit of these secondary afflictions. Just know as a preview that we will have the 4 changeable mental factors yet. And then there's a bit of a concluding part to this text, giving us some discussion around practice and so on. And then we'll see where we go from there in terms of our Wednesday nights. It's going to be tricky because I'm, be taking off at the end of April, so we'll see what we end up doing for those weeks, but we'll find something certainly that hopefully will be engaging for everyone. So let's go to the prayer book and do our dedication prayers as usual on page 235. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Page 244. We'll do the 2 prayers there for our precious teachers, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche. As usual, I encourage you to think about all the teachers that we and others have and make strong prayers for their good health and long lives so that we and others can always experience the glory of having perfect gurus in our lives. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the 3 jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then finally dedicate for whoever you're holding in your heart right now, whether it be beings that you actually know or beings in parts of the world who are going through difficult experiences right now. But dedicate for the removal of the suffering of all of these beings, whether they are experiencing obstacles or illness, are dying or have died. Think that through the force of what we've done here tonight, their suffering is alleviated and they have all the causes that will lead to perfect peace and happiness. And may all beings know true happiness through our efforts here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. Okay, thank you all online.